We're live.
Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion on regulating app stores organized by the Alliance of Digital India Foundation, ADIF, in partnership with the Coalition of App Fairness, CAF. As you may know, ADIF is a think tank for India's digital startups, and CAF is an international, independent, not-for-profit founded to advocate for freedom of choice and fair competition across the app ecosystem. I'm Rohit Kumar, founding partner at the Quantum Hub, a public policy consulting firm, and I'll be moderating this discussion. Let me begin by setting some context for our audience. We've come together today to talk about a very important issue that is likely to have a strong bearing on the future of India's digital economy, which is increasingly becoming mobile first. As you know, mobile apps provide a range of services and are usually downloaded from digital marketplaces that are called app stores. All mobile devices come with at least one native app store that is pre-installed. This depends on the operating system which the mobile device uses. iOS and Android, run by Apple and Google respectively, are the major mobile operating systems currently, with a combined market share worldwide of 99.25% as of December 2021. In India, Google actually dominates the market, with Android's market share being 95.24%, while Apple's iOS is much smaller at 3.76%. Consequently, the native app stores on these operating systems, the Play Store for Android and what is called the App Store for Apple, are the major players in the app marketplace. While some other app stores exist and apps can sometimes also be downloaded via websites, these are very limited, and actually most app downloads happen through either the Play Store or the App Store. Therefore, by virtue of being gatekeepers to the mobile ecosystem, Google and Apple's policies affect a wide swathe of users and developers, and changes to these policies can fundamentally alter market dynamics. One policy that has received a lot of attention in the recent past has been Google's decision to enforce a 30% commission on in-app purchases, or IAPs that are called, by mandating the use of its own payment system. So under this policy, developers will be effectively barred from using any other payment system, and they'll also have to pay a steep commission. So several Indian businesses, and in fact, several global businesses also, have objected to this and termed this proposed policy change unreasonable. Some actually say that Google's new rules, which are already in force in some parts of the world and likely to come into force in India in 2020, could significantly dent developers' profit margins, affecting both business viability and innovation. So let me just add a little bit more, and then I'll move on to my panelists for today. What I wanted to say is that while commissions are definitely important for the operation of the store themselves, and app stores do provide some very important services to both consumers and developers, it is difficult to determine what the fair rate of commission should be, especially in the absence of competition. So it is actually in this context that we are here today. Our goal through this discussion is to deepen our understanding of the App Store marketplace, assess concerns of developers, and determine if there is a need for government intervention, and if so, how. So now with that context, let me turn to our panel. I have a very esteemed panel of speakers joining me today for the discussion, and they should be able to shed more light on the issue. I'm joined by Dr. Vikas Kathuria, who is a PhD Associate Professor, School of Law, BML Munjal University. He is also an affiliated research fellow with the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition, Munich. I'm also joined by Sijo George, who's the Executive Director of ADIF, Zai Vipra, Senior Resident Fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, is also joining us. Finally, we're joined by Hannah Ricketts, Deputy Director, Coalition for App Fairness, and Mark Buse, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Global Government Relations and Policy at the Match Group. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us in this discussion. Let me begin with this context. And Hannah, if it's okay, I would want to start with you. The first question that I actually wanted to ask you is that, can you shed some more light on the main concerns of the global app developer community with the policies of the App Store and the Play Store, and what principles has really CAF been advocating for?
Thank you, Rohit. And also I want to start by also thanking you for inviting CAF to co-host this and be involved in this really important discussion about the mobile digital economy. So I think as we've come together, originally we were only 13 members when we founded just in 2020, and now we are at over 70. And all of our developers have really coalesced around some critical issues that they face in their day-to-day work and business model. I think the first is really about that app tax that you referenced. The requirement from App Store monopolies that all of the apps that are using their systems use in-app payment systems is really, really difficult to overcome because they mandate that requirement and they also charge exorbitant high commissions. This is an issue for both large and medium companies, but it's really an obstacle that many small companies cannot even overcome. And so they never even get the opportunity to get off the ground and enter the marketplace. So I would say first is really that app tax and that in-app payment requirement is one area. The next is really, this is a much broader bucket, but it's anti-competitive practices in general. And this is a broad theme, but it's something that we hear from app developers and our members day in and day out. First is sort of that self-preferencing behavior. So putting your own products, if you are an app store and you also have apps, you're putting your own products ahead of others and self-preferencing them, giving them an advantage over competitors. This could be through ranking your apps higher or stalling improvements and bug fixes and security fixes of your competing apps. It also is about limiting access to app developers' information about their very own customers. This is about technical information and operating information that disallows those competitors from improving their products and services that they're trying to give their own end users. And we also have many examples, both within our membership and from those outside of it, of examples of app store platforms, Sherlocking is what it's called with Apple, making copycat and mimicking products that use the developer's own data to compete against it and make a product that they then get to self-preference in the App Store. And then finally, this is another broad theme, but it's really about the broken digital marketplace. And this is both for developers and their end consumers. So these two companies, Apple and Google, have complete monopolies and therefore complete control over their respective app stores. And by not allowing developers to distribute the apps the way that they want to, whether that's directly downloading from a browser or from alternative third-party app stores, the only way is through them. And so this gatekeeping is another incredible barrier that innovators are trying to overcome every day in the mobile economy. They get to decide who wins and who loses in this marketplace and who even gets a chance to play. And that's really where our members and app developers come from. When we founded the coalition, we coalesced around 10 core principles that really underline all of our advocacy and our work. And that is based in those conversations that we are hearing directly from app developers and from their customers that they're trying to support. And so I don't need to read all of them, certainly, but I can definitely give sort of the broad strokes about it. But all of our advocacy is really based in pushing back on those core issues of the in-app payment system, the broken app marketplace, and all of the self-preferencing and anti-competitive behaviors. And this is things like no app store owner or its platform should engage in self-preferencing its own apps or services or interfere with users' choice of preferences or defaults. Or another, that developers should not be required to pay unfair or unreasonable discriminatory fees, and that developers' data should not be used against them. So these seem like very common sense principles that we all are united behind, but we're up against two behemoths that really have complete control over their own ecosystems, and that's what we're united to break.
Great. Thank you, Hannah, for sort of setting that context. I wanted to actually turn to Mark now, who's also represents Match, that's also a founding member of CAF. So Mark, as a founding member of CAF and even in your own independent capacity for Match, you've opposed these policies publicly. What I wanted to understand, and I think what the audience would also like to understand, is that what has actually been the real effect of these policies on the business, on the company's revenue and its viability? And has this caused a rethink of the business model at Match? And why can't you explore other alternatives, like say other app stores or potentially web apps or websites as alternate modes of sort of bypassing this, the Google and Apple sort of one-sided monopoly, so to speak?
Hi, I appreciate the question, Rohit, because it really we appreciate it because it brings to light the real dilemma that there is. And that is, as Hannah just said, these gatekeepers, they're at the top of the bottleneck and they control everything that happens. And they ignore normal market forces and effects. So we know that Google, because it was reacting to the Korean law on this matter, we see Google react to the Indian developer concerns and postpone implementation of mandatory IAP. But what we've seen, for example, is that Google said they're going to lower the price from 30 to 15%, which is like fantastic. Everybody should applaud. But what they also are doing is Google had a variety of exemptions for companies and industries. So they're removing all of those. They are effectively copying the Apple model. And what does that mean? What that means is that they're asserting yet more power into the marketplace to decide who wins, who loses, and what happens. But what's interesting from just a pure academic standpoint, looking at it is, what free market does anybody here ever participate in where your, quote, competitor, because Apple and Google always like to point to each other as competitors, in what free market do you continue to make profit? And you never lose a customer when your price is 100% more than your competitors? It's just proof that there is no competition. That what they do is these are two siloed monopolies. And within their silo, in these walled gardens that they have created purposefully, they control what happens. They control how their customers react or what they see. And we see them exerting more power. What we know for a fact right now is that Google intends, per what they've said, to keep this 15% mandatory new set of IAP rules at the end of March. Now, in India, because of the activism of developers, Google has postponed that till October. And I would caution everybody to understand two things here. One is that if Google can do that everywhere else on the globe, it will happen in India. It will affect Indian developers, and they should not stand for it. They should say, no, we are going to either change the law, change the regulations, or go to the proper regulatory authorities and have them rectify this. But what also is become very evident in light of Korea, which passed the first law of its kind anywhere on the globe, outlawing mandatory in-app payments. And then in the Netherlands, where the regulatory authority determined that Apple's mandatory use of in-app payments violated not just Dutch law, but EU law as well. And what we've seen is that these companies are ignoring the law. They have this belief that they are above the law. I guess they're just so big and they feel so secure in their positions that they can just simply say, we'll accept a payment or two and we'll be fine. But regulators are no longer accepting that. And just today, the head regulator in the EU, Madam Vice President Vestager, publicly condemned Apple for its behavior. We know these companies do react to government pressure and to a unified developer community. So I just encourage everybody to keep the fight going, to escalate the fight, and not allow these monopolies to create more power and more ability to control what us as consumers see.
Mark, before I actually go on to Sijo, I also wanted to ask you another follow-up question that I think will help our users understand this better. So right now, for instance, what what happens with apps that run on advertising? So do they get out of so they don't have to pay anything, and apps that are based on subscription paid, they are the ones that are getting hit, right? And
Yeah.
okay,
That is exactly it.
and how is this affecting? So is this creating pressure on developers to change business models, to look at how they do business, or how has thinking in Match evolved basis this?
Yeah, I mean, what it is Apple deciding arbitrarily what business models will succeed and not. It's the apps that monetize via advertising that essentially Apple and Google have decided will get advantages in the marketplace. And apps that market directly to consumers via subscription or one-time purchases, a la carte purchases, those apps, however, will pay 30% or 15%, depending on where you are and how you operate. But why should the gatekeeper decide the best business model? Isn't that best left to the developers to decide? Match relies entirely on subscriptions for our revenue. We chose that model because we believe it's the most transparent and it gives the consumers the most amount of say, because consumers will either like your product and purchase it, very, very transparent transaction, or they don't like it and you don't succeed in the marketplace, which is ideally the way it should operate. Let consumers vote with their money, with their feet, and act. Instead, what we see is some of these companies that monetize in a different manner, selling your data, where their incentive is to keep your eyeballs glued to the screen at all times, which, there are a lot of questions about how healthy that might be and what are the real societal effects of that. The other aspect of this, and Rohit, I'm sorry, I didn't answer it in my previous question, but Match expense, our single largest expenditure is the fees we have to pay Apple and Google. Now, our competitor Facebook Dating, because they monetize through ads, pay $99 a year to be in the App Store and enjoy app distribution. Match pays over $500 million a year US for App Store distribution. Now, if somebody can, explain the logic for why one competitor is paying $500 million and another competitor is paying $99, I would love to hear the explanation for that. But it just doesn't make any sense. Again, it shows the arbitrary nature of these gatekeepers, and it shows their power. In the marketplace, that could never happen in an open marketplace.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for sharing that perspective. I think it really helps. I want to now contextualize this discussion to the Indian context. So, Sijo, if you could come in and tell us a little bit about the experience of your members in the Indian market, where Google is the major player. And as I understand, Google is yet to implement these policies in India, partly because of the huge pushback that we saw last year and before that. So what do you foresee for businesses and developers in the Indian ecosystem, especially in their ability to innovate and grow, if these policies are kicked into place this year?
To bring in the Indian context, right? So these policies and the implementation of specifically the app tax, understandably, is a major issue, which would really affect the revenues and the margins of every business that's generating revenue of the store, right, via selling digital goods. But to really understand the India story, right, I'll probably like to lean on a bit on what Hannah mentioned at the start. The problem really has always been about the anti-competitive practices that we've been continuously seeing on the store, right? And I don't think both Apple and Google were any different in terms of how they used to implement various things in a very arbitrary, high-handed manner. And I think we'll have to really stress on those two words again and again, right? And all was done in the name of App Store policies, right? Now, even the policies, half the time, you don't really have clarity in terms of what those clauses mean. Some are sweeping. And as you rightly said, given the market power, which is highly skewed in favor of Google and Apple, it's virtually, you can bulldoze any sort of new rule, and you can even make rules on the fly. So to bring in the Indian part of the story, and that's what's happening. I'll come back to Mark on what part he mentioned. So the Indian story, what we had been noticing is that a lot of apps were being taken out of the store very arbitrarily, right? Now, is it self-preferencing? Is it a lax of policy? All those questions do arise. But what was happening is most of these instances were happening in isolation. So it took us some time to even understand that almost every developer, every app owner, every startup who has a reasonable presence has had to face with an instance where they were taken out of the store. And the manner in which it was happening was also very problematic. Half the time, there is hardly any notice. One fine day, you wake up and you see that your app is not there in the store, right? Even if there is some sort of a notice, it's either very vague and there's nobody to talk to. Hopefully you'll send an email and somebody might respond. So, and we're talking about legitimate businesses, right? These are not shady fly-by-night operators, which we actually see, flourishing on the stores as well. That's a different problem altogether. These are legitimate businesses, right, who have revenues, who significantly contribute the revenues of some of these, stores in the first place. At the same time, when the business goes under, there's hardly anybody or anything to reach out to, right? On top of this, and people who are familiar with how the story developed in India, one of the biggest flashpoints happened where one of our, poster boys in the Indian startup ecosystem, the Paytm app, was taken out of the store one fine day. And that was one of the major, so that sort of signals the amount of market power they enjoy, right? And that was one of the starting points which triggered this particular movement. And right after that, we had Google also announcing that starting a deadline, they will mandatorily ask every company to only comply by using their payment gateway and charging exorbitant fee of 30%. Now, suddenly, this became a major issue, understandably. The impact on revenues is significantly high. To bring in the India context, I don't think the basic principles are very different. But to bring in the India context, India is a very, I would say, price-conscious consumer, so to speak, right? And so the margins are typically very thin in terms of most services or most companies that they make. And on top of it, a 30% tax, right, is going to be super debilitating for companies. So not just big companies, even the medium companies, you might see them, go out of business. And look at also the, inefficiency such a policy will create in the market, right? As Mark was mentioning, a company should have the freedom to pursue the business model that best respects their users and choices, right? But if I'm losing 30 to 40% of my revenue, and I'm forced to actually consider ad-based models or freemium models as my way of even exploring markets, these are not happy situations a developer faces. And I have seen instances, unfortunately, given the scenario, I can't disclose specific names. I have had instances where founders have come back and said that I'm even going back to the web to build my next startup. I don't even want to be beholden to these companies for even my tech stack, forget distribution, right? Now, that is a point at which this conversation has gotten to, if you bring in some of the India context. Now, in terms of how we are viewing it, so India, we have this famous movie called Lagan, which was an iconic movie in itself, which sort of brings about the imageries of, let's say, colonial era, where the tax, the equivalent of that is an unfair tax is Lagan, right? So we started calling it a Lagan because it's not really about the commission, right? It's about the unfairness of how arbitrarily and unilaterally Google and Apple decides what is best for the market and consumer. So to take a leaf out of what Mark said, right? On the face of it, it seems like benevolence when they actually slash commissions from 30 to 50, right? But even in that particular scenario, the fact that they can unilaterally dictate prices actually reflects the amount of market dominance that they enjoy, right? But if you remove remove the top headline, if you look at the fine print, you have all these categories in which who gets to be falling under that category for the benevolence, so to speak. That power still rests with these marketplaces in the first place, app stores in the first place. But more critically, even that 15% announcement, when we started unpacking a bit more, even the guidelines or the specifics were not really clear, right? It was more of an announcement and the policy changes were not even reflected. So it's still more distraction or headline management or buying time, which actually favors these two companies more than anything else. And we are seeing different versions of that happening in the instance that Mark mentioned in the Netherlands. We are seeing Apple flouting compliance and paying fine as if it's a cost of doing business, right? In South Korea, we are seeing an instance where they are blatantly not complying and coming out with, I really don't know what exactly to term it, but a very, very novel circumverted way to actually keep the commissions. And more critically, and I think we should not miss out this point, right? More critically, when they actually take direct API access, they have critical information of consumers, pricing, everything, right? Which actually is the IP of businesses. And the fact that these companies operate in some of these domains should itself be concern for regulators and competition watchdog to step in and understand how these things happen. So these are some of the areas which are in a common platform. And that's where the fight is also moving. Specifically in the Indian context, we were very concerned about the deadline, impending deadline. So yes, there was an investigation by the competition watchdog in terms of these app market practices, but we also had a deadline. So we as ADIF actually went ahead and had filed an interim relief petition with the Competition Commission of India. Our plea was very simple and straightforward. Until the investigation is complete, there should be a status quo. Because in the absence of a status quo, and Google still unilaterally goes ahead and implements a policy, that will force a lot of companies out of business. It'll sort of create irreparable damages to a lot of companies. And that is why we had went ahead with that interim relief petition. As a result of all these cumulative effects, and I think at this juncture, I'd also love to give a huge shout out to the work CAF and Match and all doing, the pioneering work that they've done specifically in this particular field, the amount of commitment, passion, thought leaders they brought, that has really brought about a global, conversation also and a convergence of these kinds of scenarios as well. So as a result of which, in India at least, we have a situation where the deadline extension has been extended by another 6 months. And at this point in time, we are hoping we will have the Competition Commission report also coming before that. So that's what we are looking forward to next. But even at that juncture, I'd like to note that 2 points even on that extension, right? One, as Mark said, the problems of developers are across the globe, and we stand in solidarity with the issues of developers across the globe as well. And the unfairness is not just limited to the developers in India. So yes, this policy has to be applicable across the globe, and that's something we would completely stand by. And as a strategy, right, if the entire world is using it, we should not allow Google and Apple to use it as an instance to actually say that everybody has switched over. So why don't we also switch it to other markets as well? In this particular scenario, even when they extend the deadline, Google still tried to shroud it under the guise of saying that they're still shouting that message in the guise of benefiting developers. The message has been that we're giving developers more time to integrate the UPI and other frameworks in India. And that's a messaging that they took. At no point, and that I think is my biggest concern, at no point there has been acknowledgement on the part of the Google or even Apple for that matter, and Google is more specifically affecting the Indian market, in terms of really addressing what the heart of the concern is. It's not really about the exact commissions per se, if the services that is being offered are far superior, by all means, make it an open market and people will still subscribe to your services. Let that, let the market play it out. But forcing their hand is not the right way to go about it. And those are principles we want to, keep challenging. We have a lot of developers who have come together. So we have about 470 alliance members with ADIF right now. A large part of them are directly affected by this direct policy implementation, but almost all of them has been at the receiving end of anti-competitive practices, be it arbitrary enforcement of rules, or be it any other problems that they've had to face in the name of App Store policies. Most recently, Sherlocking and those instances Hannah briefly mentioned, we had even come across instances where some of the app developers, some of the apps were even shadow banned. So there was no notification, there was no intimation, but when you search on the store, those apps are now not visible. If you click on the direct link, the app loads up on the store. So it is not even possible for the developer to even know that the app has been banned. And interestingly, correlation cannot necessarily mean causation. Interestingly, some of the developers who have been more vocal about it have been at the receiving end. So these are observations we want to surface from the Indian market scenario. Over to you, back over.
Thank you, Sidhu, for that brief. Let me now turn to two of our panelists who've been looking at it more from an academic research lens. Because I wanted to come to you first to sort of get your perspective. So, I mean, we've heard the developers so far, we've heard developers' representatives to understand their concerns. But what I wanted to ask you is that, and also say that businesses in tech usually have strong network effects, right? And unlike in the physical brick and mortar space, expansion can happen very rapidly. And that's probably, I think, one of the reasons why there's been a lot of concentration of market power in these two companies. But do you think prima facie there is a cause for concern that the government should take notice of? Is there a market failure that merits attention? What do you think of the problem?
Thank you so much, Rohit. So we already know about facts. And these are real facts. Hannah, Mark, Sijo, they work with developers. They have seen where the rubber meets the road. So I can tell you, like, building upon the facts, building upon the complaints that the app developers have against these two big tech monopolies in their own specific markets, network effects definitely, are a big concern in these markets. And if you look at network effects, they make the market tippy. It's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. But the context that we have at hand, it is definitely a very bad thing. Sijo mentioned that they approached the Competition Commission of India with a request for some interim injunction, some interim relief. You see, by the time the competition machinery moves, the market may have already tipped in the favor of your competitor app, right? What will you do even if you get some sort of relief from the competition? It would be some sort of a rap on the knuckle, right? You have already lost your market. And mind you, the product that we are talking about, these are the products that where competition is characterized by innovation. You compete on new products, not on prices. And these markets are characterized, or rather, what we witness is gale of creative destruction. They change overnight. So by the time our already existing laws provide you relief, it is often too late. And you couple network effects with economies of scale, economies of scope, these markets become very concentrated, and hence we need new system of law or new system of regulation that could account for technological and economic realities of digital markets.
Cool. Thank you for giving that perspective. I think that really helps. Zai, if you want to build on the question that I asked Vikas, I also wanted to ask you, as you build on that question, that if you see any parallels that you see with other sectors within India or outside where we've seen similar issues in the past. And some of the arguments, of course, are that let the market play out, it will correct itself. But do you think that will happen? Do you think the government should step in before we wait for the market to correct itself?
Yeah, thank you, Rohit. I agree with Professor Kathuria. I think that this is an example of rent seeking by either a monopoly or a duopoly, depending on what you think the relevant market is. So the CCI, for instance, thinks that even if Apple has a very low market share in India, the relevant market itself is iOS. So and it controls 100% of the iOS app store market. So in that manner, it is a monopoly. And it's important, I think, to recognize that what we are seeing is a privatization of the marketplace itself, which contains other market failures, including information asymmetry as well. So the marketplace has more data on you than you do on yourself as well. And the owner of the marketplace is also a market participant. So these are all manner of distortions in the market that definitely need to be corrected. I think all markets tend towards monopolization, but the pace is faster for digital markets, I think, due to obviously network effects, data enclosures, and also algorithmic control that the platform itself is able to wield. And I think that in the interest of innovation and competition, the government should definitely intervene. Um, for parallels in terms of how different regulations have worked before in similar situations, I think telecom network interoperability is something very important to look into. And it doesn't mean that you have very competitive markets in the telecom sector. In fact, in India, you really don't. But it still means that you can call from a Vodafone mobile phone and to a Geo phone, and there's no issue, in the interoperability over there. But in terms of app stores, there's no such interoperability. I think another good set of regulations to look into is open banking in the UK, or PSD2 in the EU, where banks are made to share their data in a safe and privacy-friendly manner, and with the consent of the data subject, as it were, to other market players. So that enforced openness of data with privacy safeguards, I think, is an important model to consider even for app stores as well. It's also important to see where in similar markets no action has been taken, and thus the market has somewhat failed in the sense that it is not performing at its optimum. So Amazon, as an e-commerce marketplace, it is also a market participant and similarly uses a lot of other market participants' data to compete with them. And we know that in the US, evidence has shown that it charges about the same level of commission. So this 30% or 33% optimum seems to come from this sort of market structure. So I think it's important to see that if the government were not to act, this is where it would stay.
Okay, thank you for adding that. And actually, very interesting is the fact that you mentioned interoperability and you spoke about some of these things. I think I'm going to come to those later, because in the Indian context, in the recent past, I think there's been a lot of focus on developing what are called open digital ecosystems, right? Wherein for critical base infrastructure, the understanding is that that critical base infrastructure is what innovation happens on. So access to that critical base infrastructure has to be regulated. There has to be government oversight, so that businesses, innovators, developers can access it and build new products on it. And I think interoperability, whether it in UPI's case or in ONDC's case, all of that sort of comes in there. So thank you for mentioning that. I'll build on it subsequently. But before I go ahead, just for readers, I wanted to also for the audience, I also wanted us to just ask one more thing, and maybe Sijo, if you can quickly answer that and help us. In the Indian context, do you think, or are there examples where you see businesses passing on the cost to consumers, let's say the 30% commission were to kick into force? Or do you think there will be a tendency to absorb it? Is there any example that we see? Maybe, Hannah, Mark, if you've seen any examples in the US where you see how much of that money is passed on to cost is passed on to consumers and how much of it is absorbed, it'll be good to just understand that.
So in the Indian context, yes, we have seen that happening. Just to cite one example, Truly Madly is one of the dating apps that's operating in the country. Their prices are higher on the iOS store as compared to the App Store, the Android store. The Android store prices are low at this point in time, given the fact that the 30% rule is not fully implemented. So they're using payment gateways which charge only 2% commission, right? Mm-hmm. So that is one of the instances. They are also one of our charter members at ADIF. So that's one example. But I think something that is visible to everyone globally is the YouTube example, right? If you look at YouTube, the web price is sorry, the iOS price is nearly 30% higher than the web price, which is exactly the commission. But what is also interesting is YouTube being also Google property, the price on Android and the price on the web is still the same. So the 30% either don't apply to them or it's a preferential treatment. That's a different point, but that is something which is globally visible. But yes, we have seen this behavior where companies decide to pass on that benefit, pass on that higher cost to the end consumer as against absorbing it. The earlier context of lower margins come into picture. But in the Indian context, given the price sensitive consumer, that could also be very detrimental to some companies also, right? Where there could be a lot more churn, especially in OTT industry and everything. You could see a lot more churn where people decide not to move on to subscription services.
Okay. Hannah, Mark, do any of you want to come in? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it really depends on, as we talked about business models before, it's a balancing act for a lot of these much smaller apps who are trying to break into the market and trying to build their customer base. And so what we've seen is kind of a mixed bag of some really do not want to pass it along, but some, their hand is forced, where the only way that they're going to stay afloat and be able to provide this product that consumers want is to have to pass it along. And I think this also ties into another element of the hand tying, in that one of our members, for example, is the Down Dog Yoga app. And they wanted to not, at the end of a free subscription, as we've all probably done many free subscriptions and trials over our lifetimes, they did not want to continue the automatic payment processing. They did not feel that it was in the right interest of their consumers at the end of the day to have that continue on a monthly basis. But the App Store platforms require that they continue to mandate that continue automating, that if you sign up for a free trial, that at the end of it, no matter what, the consumer is automatically charged. And just due to the practices and the mandates of this system, their hand was forced, and they pulled their app out of it, and they didn't have another path to go forward until they came out publicly. And that was the only time it changed. And so I think when we think about these commissions and we think about these payment systems, we also think about some of those bigger anti-competitive and strong-arming business practices that really hamstring developers and their end users. Because Down Dog looked at this and they thought, this doesn't work for my customer base. I don't think this is right. And tangentially to this, they knew that they were going to get a lot of requests for refunds, that they were going to get a lot of their users coming to them for help that they couldn't even process, that they could not even grant those refunds because of Apple controlling it all.
Sorry, I'm very glad that you mentioned that example, because in India, for instance, there has been an e-mandate regulation that the RBI recently brought in, specifically against this practice of people getting billed without having realized that they subscribe to something, and it keeps happening month on month. And by the time you want to do something, the debit has already been made. And because of what Sijo also mentioned earlier about the Indian consumer being very price sensitive, the Reserve Bank of India came in with a regulation that there have to be pre-debit notifications, right? And you have to seek approval. So I think it's very interesting, the example that you mentioned, and how it will even fit into what the Indian policymaker is, for instance, thinking about. Now, before I go ahead, Mark, do you want to come in with anything?
Yeah, well, it's also that they impose these arbitrary one-size-fits-all billing and payment schemes. A lot of the most robust age group user set that uses dating apps today are younger people at the, just starting their careers. So they're at a low point in how much money they earn. They need, it's young users like that, 21-year-olds, 23-year-olds, who probably don't have enough money to buy a 6-month subscription and pay for it all at once. But Apple and Google will not let companies, developers, break those payments out. So, for Match, we very much want to offer flexibility to the user. So where we can offer payments, we will let people pay weekly or monthly for a 6-month subscription. Apple and Google do not allow that. You have to pay for per their terms. Our ideas center around, if somebody wants to sign up for a product on Wednesday and they want to be billed on Wednesdays, let's bill them on Wednesday, right? Let the consumer decide what's best for them. But if you use Apple and Google's system, you don't have that option. They determine the billing rate. And then one other aspect that I think is so vitally important to small developers who are starting. And let's just be very honest here, a huge amount of the newest innovation, the next cool thing is being developed in India by super bright people coming out of university and deciding, how about this idea or that idea? Apple and Google, when they collect the payment, you would think, oh yeah, okay, I'll make some money here, I'll get that money from my users. They actually hold on to that money for upwards of 90 days, which means you as the developer don't have the money to pay your employees or to hire a 6th employee if you have 5, because they're holding on to that money as the processor. Now, if you go to a store today and you use your credit card, they don't hold on to it. There's laws and rules around that. So they process it quickly. They get you the money. They allow the marketplace to work in a robust manner. But again, because you have these monopolies with control, they'll sit on the payment and not revert it to you until it suits their purposes, more or less. Again, all arbitrarily decided in a black box. So those sorts of behaviors really dampen innovation. They depress the next great app from being built. And it's all about, for these gatekeepers, control of the marketplace. But it's affecting everybody. And in the pandemic, we all started using apps more and more and more, right? We all had to isolate. At the same time, where families are struggling to get by because they're not in the workplace and work has changed, Apple and Google are posting record profits. And I'm not denying them that. I think it's wonderful for a company to be able to post great profits. It's what we all want. But there is something a bit unseemly about using your gateway powers to bring in these profits when average consumers are actually suffering and having a hard time.
Thank you for laying that context. I wanted to now move on to the next part where I wanted to discuss some of the developments that have been happening internationally and some of the antitrust cases, or some of the legislation that different countries have been sort of putting in. Hannah, I wanted to come to you, but the others feel free to sort of come in with any comments or any other information that you want to add. But Hannah, if you could maybe start by giving us a quick overview of what are the different antitrust cases or developments, etc., that have been seen around the world, what kind of legislation is being considered, and what has been the reaction of Google and Apple to those interventions.
Yeah. And so really around the world, we have seen policymakers and regulators paying closer and closer attention to this issue and to the problems that are really undermining innovation and competition in the mobile economy. And so this is really happening in a variety of jurisdictions. I think the first to focus on is South Korea. South Korea passed the world's first landmark legislation that bars App Store platforms from mandating developers use their in-app payment systems. And this is an incredible step for the country to take, really wonderful step that pushes a lot of momentum as other regulators and policymakers are thinking about the practices that they need to resolve in their own jurisdictions. And so the response from Google and Apple, as I believe Mark referenced earlier, was pretty remarkable. First, Google stated that they would comply, and then said that they would actually have a separate service fee for using alternative payment systems. As I said, rent-seeking behavior for rents that they were not actually controlling. They wanted a separate service fee for payments that they were not actually processing. And Apple actually rejected the premise that they needed to make any changes to their policies whatsoever, which is pretty remarkable and stunning as a reaction. And so the ordinance has not been finalized. That's still in process now of figuring out all the details of compliance and what the details look like. The Korean Commission has said that the compliance plan currently lacks concrete detail. So it's really still an ongoing navigating and evolving process. But we've seen a pretty remarkable reaction from these two app store monopolies. And so it's become less of a question about their comfort blatantly rejecting the rule of law and more of a question of how they navigate it and how lawmakers can push back on that. And so Mark, I don't know if you have other comments about South Korea, but that's one of the first, and it's pretty historic legislation that as CAF, we were very excited to see pass for both Korea and around the world. And I know another that, oh yeah, go ahead.
Go, I'm so sorry.
No, okay. I think another that really we are monitoring very closely, and I think everyone is watching, and there's a lot of headlines coming out of it, is in the Netherlands, which was also referenced earlier. The Dutch Authority for Consumers and Markets, ACM, found that Apple's requirement of using in-app payment systems, imposing that on developers, violated competition law in both Europe and in the Netherlands. And so the next steps in that is that Apple put forward their proposed solution, which essentially circumvented the ACM's authority. Developers would need to submit an entirely separate app binary, which is a momentous hurdle. And instead of charging 30%, their proposal was that they would charge 26%. And so the Dutch ACM, of course, said this is unworkable and untenable for developers for this blatant rejection of the rule of law. And they have fined them €5 million per week, which now has totaled 25 million euros. But what we're seeing is that, and this is really a concern with the size and scale of these operators, they may just view these, as we said, a slap on the wrist, as just another line item of their business operations that they can just work with. And I think something that gets lost in these headlines is the end result for consumers, that as long as they continue to just have that fine and continue to operate with the status quo, consumers at the end of the day are the ones that pay that price. Those that are looking for other routes in their dating apps, that are looking to pay less, that are looking for choices, they're the ones that lose out at the end of the day. And so we're also seeing a lot of other momentum in the United States and in Europe that we're very excited about. The Open App Markets Act in the United States has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. And recently, even just earlier this month, the Open App Markets Act passed the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is a big legislative step forward in the process, on a 20-2 vote, which is really demonstrative of the bipartisan support for this bill and the momentum behind it in the US. And then, of course, the Digital Markets Act in the EU. We're also very excited by the momentum building there. There's been a lot of thought and a lot of work and a lot of consultation from developers and a lot of research that has gone into crafting that proposal. And the DMA thus far is incredibly strong. And so CAF is very hopeful and is a big supporter of the DMA as it moves through the process in the EU.
Mark, do you want to come on and add?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank ADIF for all the work that they've done on this. You know, ADIF participated in the summit that was held in Korea around this issue that the French also attended, and France right now is running the EU as president. France is serving as the president till June. And it's been absolutely vital to show, you know, companies and developers everywhere that this is not an isolated occurrence in Korea or in Europe, that India is involved and all these other countries, and the leading role that ADIF has taken has just been amazing, because to be candid, I mean, India is the only country right now where Google is saying October, and that is not by accident or by mistake. It's because they see the power that the developer community has and the fact that the government is watching. And that is what's influencing these companies. They care and react when they see this kind of front. So kudos to ADIF, and the only wisdom that I can share is please keep leading in this area.
Thank you for sort of adding perspective there, Mark. I wanted to actually now come to ADIF, Sijo. Basically, Sijo, the main question I had for you is that you guys were participating in the South Korean effort, I mean, making representations, etc. But how do you perceive these international developments, and do you think what kind of an impact do you think it is likely to have in the Indian context? And which way do you think the Indian policymaker leans? I'm sure you've met people, you've sort of made representations. What are you hearing?
Sure. So see, at the start of it itself, right, as Hannah said, this is a landmark legislation, right? It's the first of its kind. So irrespective of whichever geography or nation legislations or these kind of legislative actions develop, each of it will have an effect on other geographies and markets in that these will set a precedent, right? And it's only when such actions are taken can we also learn what kind of responses do these companies take. Some of the responses has been quite startling, so to speak, right? So to that extent, I think there is a lot of case for people from across the globe coming together, working towards finding a common solution, because this is not an isolated incident. And that's where it, be it ADIF supporting the efforts of legislators in South Korea, or CAF joining hands with us in this particular initiative. And that's the conversation that's been going on. The most heartening thing, and I think that's one of the biggest forces also, right, which will influence legislators across the globe, is the overwhelming bipartisan support that these kinds of legislative reforms are getting. So be it the Senate action, which we saw in US, or even the South Korea, right, that was also a near unanimous voting. Mm-hmm. That's also a very strong message, right? So any action anywhere in the globe will create a precedent, and that will also help each of us make progress on legislative actions in our respective markets and regulators as well. Coming back to the point on how Indian regulators are viewing this right now, so very clearly from our observations, the fact that app market owners don't have a choice, right, and there is a huge lopsided power structure, right? That is definitely of a huge concern to developers. How do we restore that market imbalance is something that is more concerning for for the regulators and lawmakers as against the commission in itself, right? Because that is something that concerns them a lot more. So that part is absolutely there. And India, I think earlier we touched upon that particular topic also, right? India as a market, right, as the regulatory policy environment has been pushing for more open public digital infrastructure, right? And that's just been the general policy or approach that has been adopted by the government. One major area we have seen a huge impact of that is the UPI domain, the digital payments domain. We have seen massive strides both in innovation and potential and market access across the spectrum, to the extent where even Google has also been a beneficiary of that, right? So in such a scenario, this is where the government is actually looking. But at the same time, there's a new observation that we are observing, be it Netherlands, be it South Korea, in terms of these companies blatantly sort of disregarding the law of the land. I think that is something that merits attention. And to the extent that I've understand how Indian regulators also work or markets also work, I don't think that is going to be something that anybody takes very lightly, right, across anywhere in the globe. So those are some of the initial thinkings in terms of direction here. Through our interactions, we are hoping, or we are looking forward to a very positive outcome in the favor of developers as far as this particular fight is concerned. But we have an equally important role to play in terms of continuing the fight and actually addressing the other anti-competitive practices as well. And that is also where we as ADIF will continue to take this journey in terms of representing the app developers. And goes without saying, all of us will learn and collaborate with each other. This is one, good issue. I think the regulators around the globe is also converging in terms of how they're viewing the whole problem.
Yeah. Great, thank you for that perspective. Because I wanted to come to you to sort of understand from a legal perspective. So, I mean, see, I think a lot of countries are trying to pass a law. Korea did it, US is considering it, EU is considering it. But I think passing a law is also difficult, right? And it's going to have its own gestation period. India has been debating the data privacy law, and I think it's taken forever. There is also reports that maybe the government is going to do a fresh rethink on it. So my first question to you is, one, how feasible is this legislation? What are the kinds of impediments we might face? Secondly, is there the competition angle? There are already cases in front of CCI, etc. How effective is the current Competition Act from a digital markets perspective? Do you think that can help solve the problem? Maybe that needs a few tweaks instead of a new legislation. What is your view?
Right. The question that you asked, it needs a bit of background. Often the parallel is drawn with the telecommunication sector when we are talking about the right kind of regulation for digital markets. I don't think it's a very good analogy. It does not present as a very good, starting point. Why so? Because if you look at telecommunication, the biggest problem that telecommunication regulation tries to fix is that of lack of competition, because telecommunication companies previously, they were government monopolies. So when the regulation came in, interoperability and other regulation, other provisions, they are basically trying to induce competition in the telecommunication sector, or at least part of telecommunication sectors. But when we are talking about digital market, it's a different creature altogether. Sijo was using the term fairness. Contestability, fairness, and trust, these are the three underlying features of the digital market regulation. When Mark mentioned that these Google and Apple, they are sitting on the payment for 90 days, or for that matter, when Hannah mentioned auto debit, or maybe it was Sijo, they were not necessarily referring to contestability, not directly. This is a bigger issue of fairness. And a legal mind is very jittery when terms like public policy and fairness come into question, right? Because we can't define, we can't wrap our hands around it, we can't put a bracket around these things. But these are going to be the defining features of all sorts of legislations in the world. Let me tell you something. Hannah mentioned a Digital Markets Act. She also mentioned the 5 bills that have been presented before the US Congress. I also am giving you one more example of Digital Market Task Force from the United Kingdom. These 3 legislation, they might have different modalities, structure, etc., but they all are using the term fairness, that look, digital markets have to be fair. All right. So contestability and fairness, they would be leitmotif. Along with that, trust will also be a feature of digital markets. If you are taking my data, my proprietary data, and using it in your products and services, you are violating my trust. This should not happen. So the nature of digital markets would be much bigger. All right. Now, other thing is that what sort of role can the Competition Commission of India can play? It can play a very limited role. Let me tell you the reasons. First, we have seen that the competition machinery is more often than not very slow. The second thing is the kind of market failure we are discussing. It's not a typical abuse of dominance scenario, which is resulting from super mammoth market power. Here in this case, abuse can happen even if the party is not dominant. All right, we are talking about a special, scenario when these gateways or these gatekeepers are controlling a bottleneck, even when they are not dominant. All right, so you may call that they have significant market power. The English, they call it strategic market status, and the European, they call it gatekeeper position. All right. So you can't touch them unless they are dominant through the standpoint of competition law. And hence, we need something else, right? And the second thing, and the third thing, which is very important, is that we need to move fast, and we need to move even before the harm has happened, because these markets are tippy. And that is why competition law plays a very limited role, and we need a new tool. And this new tool would be ex-ante regulation. So this is what my take is on the purpose of, or rather the role that competition law can play in these markets. Over to you, Rohit.
No, thank you so much. I think that's a very interesting perspective that, what are the limitations of the competition law, especially in a digital markets situation. Zai, if you want to come in to add to anything that Vikas said, or, your own view on this issue, that'll be great.
Yeah, thanks, Rohit. I'm not a lawyer, but what I can provide is some general directions in which policy can be thought of. So I think one is the unbundling of the payment system from the App Store itself. And I mean, there's no real economic reason why these should be bundled. The other is the unbundling of the App Store from the operating system. And the third is that we should start thinking about legislation, regulations for algorithmic transparency and accountability, including things like even on financial transparency, where algorithms are making some financial decisions in terms of how much money was collected and at what time periods it was disbursed, and search algorithms, how the decisions were made in terms of which app shows up first when you search for something. And also, if if the competition commission were to give directions, I think an important lesson is that they should be very specific. So for instance, how the Russian Federal Anti-Monopoly Service for search engines gave the decision that to Google, that on your phones you must show this type of screen and it should show Google as well as Yandex, and the person should be able to choose. At that level of specificity, I think, is important, because as we've seen, the companies in question here are very quick to look for loopholes. And as multiple people have mentioned, fines are just a cost of doing business. So I think it's important that people consider specificity, and also non fine related penalties that are also not criminal penalties, but civil penalties, such as even a restriction of market access, which is a civil penalty. I think it should be on the table, and is within the power of governments to do.
No, I think that's a very interesting point you mentioned about specificity, because earlier, as Hannah was saying, what's happening in Netherlands is a little worrying, that even when you do give a judgment, it doesn't necessarily come to anything. But I wanted to question you on one particular thing you said, which is around algo transparency, right? I mean, I think in the recent version of the JPC report in India, there was this question around algorithmic transparency that JPC is demanding of tech players. There was also a lot of pushback on that, even from the small startups and developers, right? And that the fact that this is proprietary information, it's something that they're building innovation on. So what do you think of that? Do you think that's something that can really materialize?
See, I think transparency doesn't have to mean that you just, tell everyone what your code is. It means that certain things need to be revealed, and also can mean algorithmic standards. So things like you need to have such and such level of person verifying a sensitive type of algorithm, or you need to have error rates that are below this kind of error rate, especially for things like facial recognition. Not to go too far into a tangent, but the point is that transparency can have different levels, and also includes things like you can test without revealing the data as well. So there are ways to test algorithms that do not actually reveal sensitive data or trade sensitive data. So I think it shouldn't be a concern in terms of obviously the regulation has to be drafted correctly.
I will come to you, Vikas, once again to build on what Zai said. But Zai, one more thing that you had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to ask you. See, legislation will take time, I think. And Vikas had also said that the competition law may not be an appropriate forum to handle this kind of a issue. But India, as you've seen, has been building the digital platforms. ONDC has been an attempt to sort of bypass what the legislation may not be. I mean, there is legislation for e-commerce. They're coming up with rules on e-commerce, but I think it's not really making a dent. And they have started to think about platform approach to building that bit digital. Do you think there is that kind of a solution that can be experimented with here?
Yeah, the slightly unformed thoughts I have on this are, what is usually ignored is that there is a cost of development for different app stores. So even for two types of app marketplaces to develop two different types of apps is a cost. And so even if you made that market competitive, I don't think that that would automatically reduce your costs. What you need is a level of interoperability or a level of public infrastructure along the stack somewhere, so that you're able to make public what should be public and what is currently privatized, I think.
Great. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Vikas, anything you want to add to that, or after that, any other panelists, if you have any thoughts on what they just said?
Yeah, just two quick points, like building upon what Zai said. Of course, like transparency is a big feature. You do not have to approach a problem from just one standpoint, that is ex ante regulation for digital markets. You can also think about transparency through a mechanism like Digital Services Act. Okay, you do not share your algorithm with me. I don't want to look at it, right? What sort of sorcery goes into it? I won't be able to discover it. So bring in independent, neutral academics who can have a look at it, who can verify it, who can scrutinize it, and can tell you whether it is functioning properly or not. So the idea is not to steal your proprietary information, but just to put it under some sort of scrutiny that can independently be undertaken. And the second thing I want to just have a small concern with is the structure that we are talking about, this Indian creation of ONDC, which is in the form of digital public goods. So how it comes from, okay, Mr. Nilakani and others, they are trying to introduce an e-commerce sector, which is a wonderful idea, which sort of is trying to create platforms of platform. A wonderful thing, right? But what might work in e-commerce may not be appropriate in the case of mobile phone operating systems, right? They are closely integrated to the company. Of course, and there are other issues as well. And as we had started with that, look, they are also doing something. They have to capture fraud. They also have to make sure that the mobile ecosystem is vibrant, and that's why they should get some money. We are willing to pay them some sort of incentives, maybe one-time fee, and etc., etc. So I would be a bit skeptical about creating a structure of ONDC for app stores or something similar.
Okay. No, thank you for adding that. And no, you're right. I mean, there is work that is done by the app stores. The question is that what is a fair price? And I think it's just difficult to determine a fair price in the absence of competition. And what Zai had mentioned and was just something, an idea that is probably worth exploring as we sort of go ahead. But I understand that, of course, it's not something that many of us have thought about very deeply. So maybe that's something only at the next.
Right. Here, if I may just add one point quickly, that we also often approach this issue of app store payment through the standpoint of this being exploitative. This could be exclusionary also, as we have seen that it could create some sort of distortion in the downstream market. But the bigger problem with the digital market is that it has skewed the incentive structure. The business people would know that risk is proportional to incentive. The bigger you risk, the bigger the incentive you take home. But this equation is not being followed in digital markets. Look at these app stores, people. They are engaged in good, vibrant, dynamic competition with each other. But who is it that is making the most out of it? The business model of operating system is tying its profitability to the success of an app. So if an app becomes successful, it's just not the app which is making money, it's the operating system which is making money. And this distorts the risk, should be proportional to incentive structure, and hence it is unfair. And this is happening not just in the case of operating system, by the way, it is also happening in the case of most favored nation price parity clauses. So if I am dominant, I can tell you that if I have market, do not put your hotel or some products on any other channel. So we have to approach this from the standpoint of fairness, which has multiple facets in case of digital markets.
I think the way you captured that last point about, ultimately for businesses, the reward has to be proportional to the risk. I think that puts it very fairly, explains it very well. Sijo, I understand you wanted to sort of add something.
Just a minor point. So I know that all of us want to have a solution. So just to build on to a point Zai mentioned, the specificity. Yes, we are observing a scenario where when the judgments are not specific, some of the edge cases the loopholes are being exploited by some of these companies. But sometimes we have to be careful what we wish for in a digital market or an innovation ecosystem. Now, sometimes specificity can be very constraining for innovation as well. So just wanted to bring in that, just that point. So I'm not sure. And we have seen those instances, right? When we have very specific guidelines coming from the government, sometimes it might be very restrictive. While the intent might have been to help the smaller companies from abuse by bigger companies, some of the specificity might end up harming the smaller companies a lot more, be it compliance, be it the innovation, just as a note to the discussion.
No, thank you for adding that. I think that's an important perspective. I mean, we've seen that happening enough number of times, I think, in the Indian context. Now, I think we have all the arguments and the information in place. I wanted to sort of go to the third and the last part of the discussion, where I just wanted to go to each panelist and ask for their top recommendations for this particular issue. And how they foresee what are some of the key things they would want policymakers and regulators to look at to try and address this challenge. Maybe Hannah, if we could start with you, and then I'll go on to the others.
Thank you, Rohit. And I think the word that comes to mind, top of mind, is really comprehensive. Comprehensive and meaningful is really the policy that needs to be put in place. And I think, to Sijo's point, there do need to be specifics, but they need to be broad and encompassing to make sure that there is meaningful action behind these policies to promote the digital future we know policymakers want to foster. So I would say that policymakers everywhere, including in India, should create comprehensive policies that meaningfully address all the aspects of the monopolistic practices, and also create a consistent code of conduct for developers to operate in. And really, this is all about building that fairness that we keep going back to, that fairness. And so this should be about specific concerns like the 30% fees and anti-steering and lack of interoperability, barring third-party distribution through other app stores, the self-preferencing practices that we know are running rampant. And the other side of this coin for policymakers that we've discussed in depth here is really that app store platforms will stop at very little to protect their monopolies. And so ensuring that there are no loopholes and room for interpretation in these policies is also critically important, because we have seen that those will be exploited or created if it is too loose and not fully comprehensive. We really continue to see these app store platforms try and create these loopholes on a regular basis around the world. And then finally, I think the further extension of that is ensuring that there are strong enough punitive measures in place when there is non-compliance and there is a continued circumvention of the rule of law, because otherwise we're not going to have that consistent code of conduct, and we're not going to have that innovative, fair, competitive digital marketplace that we know we all want for both developers and consumers alike.
Thank you. Mark, would you want to come in, and also if you have any specific actions you would also want to take, want policymakers to take, if you could bring that in, I think that'll be good.
Yeah, the one word I would point to is enforcement. You can have the best laws in the world, but if there aren't enforcement tools available for regulators and government officials, then history has shown us they're meaningless, because fines don't matter. I mean, if you look at the fines that have been levied to date, and I'm not talking the 5 million euro fine in the Netherlands, but huge fines, billion-dollar fines that have come out of Europe. And if you look at the stock of the companies who are fined, on the very days they were fined, their stock actually went up. And it's because they have now built into their business model the fact that these fines are just parts of doing business. And that is a clear indication that you need a robust enforcement to actually compel these companies to do the right thing and to follow the law.
And are there any specific, so for instance, if a legislation were brought in, looking at what Korea has done, what US and Europe are looking at, what are some key features you would want that legislation to have?
I agree with what Hannah said. Be comprehensive, but also recognizing that really legislating is the art of the practical, not the art of the perfect. So we don't need to solve all the problems of the world when we do this. You know, I often hear, well, we need legislation that is future-proof.
Right.
You know, that might be easy to do in some conventional business streams where you know what's going to happen. But when you look at the app ecosystem and the companies that are there, the companies that are big today that weren't big 5 years ago or didn't even exist 5 years ago, it's very important to have dynamic legislation, again, with enforcement tools that can actually compel action.
Okay. And Sijo, what about you? What do you think? And some specific asks that you would have of Indian policymakers?
See, at this point, I'll rather talk in terms of wish list. We have CCI investigating. So as
Right.
against us, I'll talk in terms of wish list. So at a very broad level, right? So what we really want to see happening is balance of power. It's very skewed towards the platforms. To the point where the basic enforcement of the right to stay in business is also being challenged of the app developers. If you really understand, right, a business entity operating in a country, these platforms have power way more than even a sovereign government to come and put them out of business, right? That is to the extent where the lopsided power is there. So restoration of that imbalance in power, be it through legislative action, be it through a combination of all these methods that are available at the state disposal. I think that is my wish list. So if I were to specifically highlight one aspect which I found particularly attractive about the South Korean policy is that government, the law gives the government the right to intervene in the case of a dispute. That is equally or more powerful than just the percentage conversation as well. So that's my wish. There needs to be a more fairer balance of power in the mobile or the app economy. Goes back to what Vikas mentioned, right? We have all these distortions, and this is the only way to sort of solve for that. My second wish list, see, it's unfortunate this has come into a very antitrust legal or a legislative fight, right? And from a wish list standpoint, I would still love to see Apple and Google take a lot more of a collaborative approach. But at the very minimal, be a good faith operator in the markets as well. When blatant flouting of norms happen, right? We have different set of problems to actually comply with. So to that extent, that is another wish list I would say in terms of a stance or a position change from these companies, because these are collaborative business, so to speak, right? The App Store was also built by the innovations of all those individual talented developers who created products on top of that, right? So, and the third and the most probably important aspect I'd probably like to think, and this building on what Vikas also said in a way, right? So the markets are changing a lot. Some of the realities of the platform economy or the digital economy are very different from how digital physical markets used to function. Even if you look at the evolution of the competition law, we had something called as an MRTP Act, which was replaced by a Competition Act. And we are having very different behaviors in digital market, right? We are having instances where even without, so-called dominance in the convention sense of the competition law, you can still enforce an arm twist in certain, digital markets as well. So from a reform standpoint, regulation standpoint, yes, there is a need for regulation to step in for this particular app economy issue. And the fact that, businesses and startups are saying that, well, they typically would like not to be regulated, speaks of the gravity of the issue, right, at hand. But at the same time, you can't be keeping on regulating for every small, infraction, right? So how do we actually, equip the competition watchdogs with the enforcement tools or a different framework, which equips them, both with the capabilities and the law to better regulate and keep these, market forces or the concentration of powers in check? I think that is where a lot of regulation or a legislative reform or regulatory reform needs to happen, in my opinion. And those are areas I think all of us can continue to start contributing towards as well.
Zai, do you want to comment? What, according to you, will be the most effective and potentially least disruptive way as a to sort of come in to regulate these app stores?
Um, I think that the least disruptive way, in my opinion, would just be some rules on algorithmic standards, because they target not only the commission but also all of the other problems that are being faced by app developers. I also wanted to say that I'm not in favor of specificity in legislation as such, but in the limited cases where there's a specific problem, there has to be a specific solution in, say, a competition directive. I wanted to add that this sort of fight is implicated in other struggles as well, including the struggles of gig workers who are facing the same issues in terms of transparency and delayed payments and whatnot. And even though some app developers might be on opposite sides to these people in different issues, I think even small traders against big e-commerce companies, I think what's underlying all of it is the wanton behavior of big tech. An interesting example is Microsoft, I think, which has released its own policies for its app store equivalent, which are compliant with all the regulations. It's obviously not a big player, but, and I also suspect that it's so confident about this because it doesn't make that much revenue from advertising. But what is seen is that without alternatives that are public, without some sort of public digital ecosystems, not necessarily the specific ones being proposed in India or elsewhere, but some public digital ecosystems, some mandated data sharing where you challenge the data enclosures and the network effects in private markets. I think these problems will keep coming back in new forms. So you can't fight, small struggle after small struggle without tackling the larger issue towards the end, I think.
I think that was very well put. Thank you so much, Zai. Vikas, over to you. Your last word on this. What would be your recommendation?
Well, I would not want to end it on a philosophical note, but I can't help it, right? You see, markets exist for the welfare of masses, and digital markets are no exception. We have realized that it is not happening. There is a problem. There are market failures. High time. So let's stop spending time on making a case for regulation. Second, competition law is not a Swiss knife. There is only so much that it can do. We have already discussed the reasons. We are already seeing the repercussions. These markets we are talking about, South Korea, the Netherlands, and other places, they all have competition law, and yet these wanton acts are going on. So we need some sort of ex ante regulation. And the third thing, this ex ante regulation that we are talking about, okay, we have a solid case for it, but what you do once you have found the wrong behavior, you have to have solid blunt tools, not only remedial corrective measures, but if they do not fall in line, also in your arsenal, have the option to break them up. I think through these remedies only, you can make sure that markets start working once again for the welfare of masses.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you so much. I think that was a good philosophical note to end that, because it puts things into perspective in terms of how we should sort of think. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time. I think personally, for me, it has been a very insightful discussion. It brought out a lot of issues, suggested a lot of different ways to think about the problem. Interestingly, I think the Indian government has also been thinking a lot about how to regulate technology, and how technology has changed markets through different legislation. I mean, there's the privacy bit that's being thought about. Even there's news that the Information Technology Act may be revamped, and I think the government is also cognizant of the shortcomings of the competition law, etc. Right. So as the government thinks about it, I think it will be useful for them to even understand this issue in more detail. So what we are going to do is we'll try and put together a representation to the Ministry of Electronics and IT, Government of India, with the learnings from this roundtable to sort of sensitize them to this particular issue, and sort of send in your recommendations to them. So hopefully these inputs will, if nothing else, inform the very important policy discussion that I think is starting to take shape. And my sincere hope is that we arrive at a balanced and a long-term approach that protects the interests of all stakeholders. With that, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure speaking to everyone.